Howdy, this is Greg Swan from BloodhoundBlog.com. I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea that information wants to be free. Jeff Brown brought this up in a post the other day, and I'm not quarreling with Jeff because he's talking about something else completely different, and I thought Jeff's post was really, really great in terms of understanding human performances and the kind of biases that can lead people to make errors about the performances that people are capable of. So that by itself is a remarkably good argument, and I encourage you to pursue it and read, mark, learn, inwardly digest, because it's not about Little League baseball players, it's about sales professionals and how sales professionals can come out on top despite what others might be perceived as the deck being stacked against them. But I just want to wipe all that aside because I want to talk about the idea that information wants to be free. And Jeff cited an article from Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker that I thought was amazingly obtuse. I thought that Gladwell went out of his way to completely misunderstand the argument in order to pretend that he had issues with it. Meanwhile, it was completely a straw man. So let's go back to Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand was the Whole Earth catalog, the Whole Earth Electric Well, which was the Well, one of the first online services going way back to the BBS days in online communications. Stuart Brand said information wants to be free, and that's the part that we remember. Stuart Brand also said information wants to be expensive, and what he was talking about was the conflict between the desire of content creators to be paid for their efforts and the paradox of reproduction cost of intellectual property plunging towards zero, especially the Unit 2 cost is the way we think of it. If the Unit 2 cost of reproduction is essentially zero, then it's very, very difficult to maintain a market price on intellectual property unless it's somehow otherwise unobtainable. If you can't get it any other way, then you'll pay for it. And this is one of the issues that Gladwell raises in the post on the New Yorker is, hey, how is it that the Wall Street Journal is able to charge for their content? Well, the fact of the matter is the Wall Street Journal is able to charge for their content because the people who are paying for that content perceive that there is a pecuniary value to them in having that information, that particular information, and having it in a timely fashion without any gaps in distribution. So they're investors, and they believe that by reading the Wall Street Journal, they will invest more wisely and make more money, and therefore it's worth it to them to pay extra to get content that they can't get anywhere else that may help them make a ton of money. Why was no one willing to pay the New York Times when the New York Times tried the same kind of stunt? Because you can get essentially the same content for free elsewhere. There's absolutely no reason, I mean, notwithstanding the fact that the New York Times has really destroyed its credibility over the last 5 or 10 years by being so tendentious, but even allowing for that, the New York Times is famous for high-quality information. Why is no one willing to pay for it? Because they can get it elsewhere for free. That's the reason. The other form of the argument that information wants to be free comes from Richard Stallman. We know him from the GNU Software Foundation, but Stallman actually is an antique in the online world. He goes all the way back to DARPANET. He was the runt of the litter of the DARPANET family at MIT. And when all of the big kids went off to form their own software companies, Stallman decided that that was a deep offense to his own personal values, that anyone should charge for software. And so he basically, since then, has been a rationalist for software piracy. And the GNU Software Foundation is not a software piracy organization. It's a open source community now, because Stallman couldn't recruit too many software pirates to agree to go out and steal everything that wasn't nailed down. But that's the founding premises of the GNU Software Foundation, is all based on the idea of free software, not charging for software, which frankly, that particular line of thinking has turned out to be brilliant, not because of Stallman, but because of other people who got involved in the open source movement, including Jimmy Wales of Wikipedia fame, and made open source work. And it's a completely viable model for intellectual property creation now. We love it. There are all kinds of things that we do in the weblogging world that are heavily influenced by the open source movement. And all of this stuff is great. But really, the way to think about this, the idea that information wants to be free, is best understood in the context of Austrian economics and in the context of subjective value theory, or what you might call marginal utility theory for pricing. The very first post on Bloodhound Blog going back to June 29th, 2006 was me saying, if free or almost as free, I'm sorry, if good enough is free or nearly free, then what's the market value of slightly better? And that really is the question that's being answered by the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, respectively, in that particular debate. That slightly better in the Wall Street Journal is perceived as being truly better, and some people are willing to pay for that content. The slightly better content that you could get from the New York Times, no one perceives that as being of value, and therefore no one was willing to pay for it. And this actually has context in real estate, which we'll get back to, but really what it boils down to is this. I have a limited amount of time in my day and a level of interest that runs somewhere between 0 and 100, and I'm pretty close to the 100 end. I like to pursue a lot of information, but there's an enormous amount of information out there that is available to me that is free. There's certain information that I pay for, like my MLS subscription, for instance, but for the most part, most of the information I consume is free, and the reason for that is because there is no marginal utility to me to pay extra for slightly better. If I needed that slightly better information, and if the only way I could obtain it was by paying someone who had it hidden behind a firewall, then I would pay. But I don't perceive that value, and therefore I don't make the payment. And the way to think about any sort of price, whether that price is $0, $1, or $100 million, the way to think about any particular price is, what is my discounted cost of pursuing an acceptable alternative? And so if I'm out showing with a family and their criteria are so tight that we really only have five houses to choose among, then we're going to have to be very, very careful about rejecting any one of those houses, because if we reject them all, we won't get any of them. But if we have 50 houses to choose from, suddenly the field is much more open. If we have 500 houses to choose from, those buyers can afford to be very, very choosy, because the discounted probability of procuring an acceptable alternative is very, very low. And this is the other prevailing theory of value that we find all the time in the marketplace right now is Marx's idea of the labor theory of value. And you'll see that all kinds of different ways that people will talk about, the manufacturing cost, or years of research, or yakety spackety, blah, blah, blah. That means absolutely nothing. The labor theory of value says that a beautifully decorated mud pie is worth substantially more than an ordinary mud pie because of all the extra labor that was put into that decorated mud pie. Well, in fact, all mud pies are worth $0. No one would pay for a mud pie, and therefore it doesn't matter how much labor you invest in it. The same thing goes for cars made in Detroit. It really doesn't matter how much R&D, how much design time, how many hours of manual labor, how many spot welds. None of that matters if the purchaser doesn't perceive the value of the automobile. They won't pay for it no matter how much labor went into it. And that's the point, is value is always subjective, always in the minds of the purchaser or the seller, and that is the way that price is established. And so if we're working with sellers of real estate, and the seller says, well, my house is different, which is what all sellers say, we have to establish in strict monetary terms how that house is different from the market price. And you guys all know this, you do this all the time, but this is a discussion to have with your seller, is what is the discounted probability of finding an alternative buyer. We've got a buyer in front of us. They made an offer that we don't like because it's substantially lower than the purchase price, but what is our discounted probability of finding another buyer at the price that we're asking for? And that really is the way that you have to have this discussion with your sellers, because it's not just this particular buyer that we're concerned with, it's the market as a whole. And this is why information wants to be free, not because intellectual property creators don't want to be paid. Of course they want to be paid, but the quantity of ordinary information out there is so abundant that I, as a purchaser, have no reason to go out of pocket unless that particular information is not ordinary, unless it's extraordinary. If it's ordinary information, my probability of procuring an acceptable alternative is extremely high, is near infinity, and therefore the price should be as close to $0 as possible. That's what it means when we say information wants to be free. It doesn't have anything to do with any sort of intrinsic value of the information. It's entirely subjective. It's a matter of in the eyes of the purchaser. I'm almost at 10 minutes, so I'm going to cut off. Bless you. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.